Imagine boarding a flight, excited for a new opportunity, only to find yourself treated like you don't belong. A silent, careful exclusion, a pause before handing you your drink, a second glance at your boarding pass when no one else gets one. For Lena Whitmore, that moment of quiet discrimination wasn't just another inconvenience. It was the spark that ignited a nationwide battle. But what happens when speaking up makes you the target? Stay with us because this story takes a turn you won't see coming. Lena Whitmore sat at her desk in Booker T. Washington Public High School, her fingers gently tracing the worn-out edges of a lesson plan she had taught 100 times before. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows over the rows of wooden desks. Outside, students shuffled down the hall, their laughter and conversation echoing off the tiled floors. It was the familiar hum of a school day winding down, but inside Lena's classroom, an uneasy tension had settled. She glanced at the email still open on her laptop. The subject line stared back at her like a warning. Parental concerns regarding history curriculum. Martha Reynolds. Again. Lena let out a slow breath, pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose. She had spent 15 years teaching history, and every year it seemed like someone had a problem with how she presented the facts. This time, it was her lesson on the civil rights movement, specifically a discussion on systemic discrimination and how history still shaped the world today. The email was carefully worded but unmistakably firm. We believe some of Ms. Whitmore's lessons promote a divisive narrative that does not align with the values of our school community. We respectfully ask that she adjust her approach to be more balanced. Lena knew what that meant. Water it down, make it more comfortable, avoid making people think too hard. The knock on the door came just as she was rubbing the tension from her temples. Principal Douglas stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He was a middle-aged man with a polished demeanor, the kind of administrator who prided himself on keeping the peace, no matter the cost. "Lena," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him, "we need to talk." She leaned back in her chair, already anticipating where this was going. "Let me guess. Parent complaints?" Douglas sighed, settling into the chair across from her. "You know I support you, but this is a delicate situation. We're getting a lot of pressure from some of the parents. They're concerned about the tone of your lessons." Lena folded her arms. "The tone or the truth?" He hesitated. "They feel you're focusing too much on the negatives of American history." Her laugh was sharp. "The negatives? You mean actual history? The parts that don't make everyone feel warm and fuzzy inside?" Douglas held up a hand, his voice steady. "Lena, I need you to understand the position I'm in. We've got donors, a school board to answer to. I just need you to be careful. Maybe adjust the curriculum." "No." The word came out firmer than she expected, but she meant it. Douglas sighed again, his patience wearing thin. "Then at least consider how you present it. We can't afford more controversy." Lena stared at him, feeling the familiar exhaustion settle in. She had fought this battle too many times to count. Every year, the same fight, the same pushback. And now they wanted her to soften the truth, to package it in a way that wouldn't make certain parents uncomfortable. She thought of her students, especially the ones who had told her how much her lessons meant to them, how they had never seen their history, their stories, represented in a way that felt real before. She wasn't going to change that. Instead, she exhaled and gave Douglas a level look. "I'm not here to make history comfortable, Doug. I'm here to make sure my students understand it." The silence stretched between them. Finally, Douglas stood. "I figured you'd say that," he murmured. "But be careful, Lena. This fight isn't going away." She watched him leave, then turned back to her laptop. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she didn't respond to the email. Not yet. Her phone buzzed beside her, a notification from her inbox. She glanced at the screen and felt her breath hitch. Subject: Invitation to speak at the San Francisco Teaching Symposium. A flicker of something new, opportunity, cut through the frustration. Maybe it was time to take this fight beyond the classroom. Lena sat there for a long moment, the weight of the decision pressing against her. She could ignore it. She could stay and keep fighting the same battle in the same four walls. Or she could step onto a bigger stage, one where her voice couldn't be so easily silenced. For the first time in a long while, she felt something other than exhaustion. She felt ready. Lena stood in line at Birmingham Shuttlesworth International Airport, her carry-on bag slung over her shoulder. The terminal bustled with movement. Families huddled near departure screens, business travelers buried in their phones, and airport staff maneuvering carts through the endless sea of people. She took a deep breath, adjusting the strap of her bag. The email invitation to the San Francisco Teaching Symposium had arrived just in time. Like a sign she needed to take this conversation beyond the four walls of her classroom. Maybe she couldn't change her school's politics, but she could make her voice heard somewhere people actually wanted to listen. Boarding pass and ID, ma'am? She glanced up at the gate agent, a young man with tired eyes and a robotic smile. Handing over her documents, she waited as he scanned them. For a moment, his gaze flicked to the seat assignment, then back to her. First class? He asked, a hint of surprise in his tone. Lena arched a brow. Yes. He blinked, quickly covering his reaction with a nod. You're all set. Enjoy your flight. She tucked her ID back into her wallet, feeling the familiar prickle of being out of place in spaces people didn't expect her to be in. She had worked hard for this ticket, using the travel stipend the symposium provided, but she could already sense the silent judgments from those who assumed she didn't belong. As she walked down the jet bridge, the cool rush of recycled air from the aircraft greeted her. She found her seat, 4A, window side, and settled in. The first-class cabin was designed for comfort, but she still felt the weight of unwelcome eyes. A man in a suit across the aisle gave her a quick glance before returning to his laptop. A flight attendant, blonde and stiffly polite, moved up the aisle offering pre-flight drinks to passengers. And then came Meredith Cole, the lead flight attendant, sharp-featured with a crisp uniform that looked like it had never seen a wrinkle, stopped beside Lena's seat. There was no smile, just a thinly veiled assessment. Can I get you something to drink before takeoff? Lena smiled politely. Water, please. Meredith's expression didn't shift. Instead of acknowledging the request, she glanced at Lena's seat assignment, her lips pressing together. Are you flying alone today? Lena's smile dimmed. She had seen this before. The subtle ways people questioned her right to be somewhere. Yes, she said, her voice even. Meredith gave a slow nod but didn't move to take the order. Instead, she continued down the aisle, attending to the other passengers with noticeably more warmth. Lena exhaled, trying to let it roll off her back. Not today. She wasn't going to let this ruin today. The plane finished boarding, and soon the announcements began. As the flight crew moved through final checks, Lena tried to focus on her speech for the symposium. She had planned every word, how to frame the argument for teaching history without censorship, how to equip teachers with the confidence to resist political pressure. She was deep in thought when Meredith returned. Ma'am, can I see your boarding pass again? Lena blinked, looking up. Excuse me? Meredith's expression was neutral, but her tone carried an edge. I just need to verify your seat assignment. Lena felt the heat of several eyes turning toward her. She shifted, reaching into her bag to pull out the pass, handing it over. Meredith barely glanced at it before nodding. All set, she murmured, handing it back. Then, as if it had never happened, she turned and moved on. Lena let out a slow breath. That wasn't normal. She glanced across the aisle. The businessman with the laptop gave her a brief, knowing look. He had seen it too. The plane taxied down the runway, and soon they were airborne. Lena tried to push the encounter out of her mind, telling herself it was small, a minor thing. But 20 minutes later, when the drink service started, Meredith skipped her seat entirely. Lena watched as she served row after row, refilling glasses, exchanging polite conversation. She turned slightly in her seat, waiting, giving the benefit of the doubt. Nothing. The businessman across the aisle cleared his throat, signaling to Meredith. Excuse me, she didn't get her drink. He nodded toward Lena. Meredith hesitated, just for a second. Then with the briefest, thinnest smile, she turned back. Oh, what was it you wanted again? Lena could feel her pulse against her throat. Water, she said evenly. Meredith nodded and disappeared toward the galley. When she returned, she placed the plastic cup on Lena's tray, with just enough force for the liquid to tremble over the rim. Here you go, she said, then walked away without another word. Lena let the moment sink in. It wasn't overt, it wasn't loud, but it was clear. She sat back, pressing her lips together. Outside the window, the sky stretched endless and blue. Inside, she felt the weight of something, old and familiar, pressing down on her chest. She reached for her phone, thumb hovering over the record button. Not today. She wasn't going to let this slide today. Lena tapped her fingers against the armrest, trying to steady her breath. The cool plastic of her phone rested in her palm, screen dimly glowing as her thumb hesitated over the record button. Was she overreacting? Maybe. But then again, maybe not. She had been here before. This place where 1,000 tiny moments add up to something undeniable. The shift in tone, the extra scrutiny, the way certain people's presence in certain spaces always seemed to require justification. Her pulse was steady, but she could feel the anger curling in her chest, tight and slow burning. Across the aisle, Dr. Oliver Vance, the businessman who had spoken up for her earlier, met her eyes. He wasn't staring, wasn't pitying, just watching. After a beat, he leaned slightly toward her. "She didn't ask to see my boarding pass," he murmured. Lena let out a quiet huff of breath, equal parts frustration and exhaustion. "I figured." Oliver tilted his head slightly, considering. He was in his mid-50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses. The kind of man who had spent years navigating corporate boardrooms and academic conferences, where power lived in subtleties. "She skipped you on purpose," he added. Lena gave a small, humorless smile. "Yeah, I caught that." Silence stretched between them for a moment, the low hum of the aircraft filling the space. Then Oliver nodded toward her phone. "Thinking about recording?" Lena studied the device in her hand. It was a decision she couldn't take lightly. If she started filming, there would be no going back. But wasn't that the point? She exhaled, fingers tightening around the phone. "I just want proof," she said, keeping her voice even. "Because people love to act like this stuff doesn't happen." Oliver nodded slowly as if weighing her words. "It does. More than most want to admit." He paused. "And when it does, people like her count on one thing." Lena raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That will let it slide." Lena let his words settle in her mind. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she unlocked her phone, swiped to the camera, and tapped record. The screen flickered to life, the lens facing toward the aisle. She didn't hold it high, just enough to capture the scene naturally. The first-class cabin was calm, passengers tucked into their seats, engaged in quiet conversations or scrolling through their devices. Meredith moved through the cabin, her professional smile firmly in place as she attended to each row. Then she stopped next to Lena's seat. Lena felt the shift in energy before Meredith even spoke. "Ma'am," Meredith said, her voice carefully neutral, "I need you to lower your phone." Lena didn't flinch. "Why?" Meredith's polite mask stayed in place, but her fingers curled slightly against her notepad. "For security reasons, you can't record the crew." Oliver spoke before Lena could. "That's not true," he said, his voice mild but firm. "FAA guidelines don't prohibit recording in public spaces unless it interferes with flight operations." Meredith's jaw tightened. Just for a second. Then she turned her attention back to Lena. "I'm asking you to stop." Lena kept her phone steady. "And I'm asking if you treat all first-class passengers like this." The silence that followed was heavy. A few heads turned, subtle but noticeable. Meredith's smile grew tighter. "I just want to make sure everyone is comfortable." Lena's lips parted slightly, her patience hanging by a thread. Comfortable. That word always seemed to mean keeping people like her in their place. She could feel Oliver watching, the weight of passengers around her waiting to see what would happen next. Lena exhaled slowly, then, deliberately, tapped to stop the recording. Not because she was intimidated, but because she had enough, and because she knew what to do next. As Meredith turned and walked away, Lena opened her messaging app and uploaded the video. Then, with a short, measured breath, she typed, "First-class treatment on Skybridge Airlines. Watch how it works." She hit post, and then she waited. Lena set her phone down on the tray table, watching the screen go dark. The video was out there now, no taking it back. She leaned back in her seat, staring out the window at the vast stretch of sky, trying to ignore the familiar weight pressing against her chest, the weight of what comes next. She had spent years watching people like Meredith get away with things like this. A raised eyebrow, a clipped tone, a moment of unnecessary scrutiny, and every time the world moved on, as if nothing had happened. But not this time. Her phone vibrated once, then twice, then continuously. She swiped the screen open and watched as the numbers climbed. Likes, shares, comments. Her video was spreading fast. A reply popped up from a verified account. The Equal Rights Project. This needs to be seen. Stories like this happen every day, and they rarely make it past the people who experience them. Thank you for sharing. Her heart pounded. She glanced across the aisle where Dr. Oliver Vance had been watching her quietly. He didn't say anything at first, just gave a knowing nod. It's moving, she murmured, half to herself. He tilted his head. Good. Lena scrolled through the comments, feeling the reaction build in real time. There was overwhelming support, but also resistance. People accusing her of overreacting, of playing the race card, of making something out of nothing. She had expected that. She had spent a lifetime expecting that. But as she skimmed through the growing discussion, she noticed something else. People were sharing their own stories. This happened to my dad last year on a flight to Houston. My sister was humiliated on a train in the same way. Thank you for speaking up. Airlines need to be held accountable for how they treat passengers. This is bigger than one person. It wasn't just about her. It never had been. Lena felt a mix of vindication and exhaustion settle over her. The reality was she had started something. Whether she wanted to or not, she was now at the center of it. But that wasn't what unsettled her most. It was the fact that Meredith hadn't come back yet. That meant she had seen the video, or someone had, and right now they were deciding how to respond. Lena let out a slow breath and turned her phone face down, willing herself to stay calm. But calm was the last thing on the flight crew's mind. A few rows up near the galley, Meredith stood with another flight attendant, whispering. Her jaw was tight, her fingers gripping the edge of the drink card a little too hard. The other flight attendant, a younger woman with dark brown hair tied in a perfect bun, shifted uncomfortably. People are talking about it, she muttered. I just saw 2 passengers retweet it. This is going viral. Meredith exhaled sharply. Of course it is. Her fingers curled, then flexed as if she were weighing her options. This is getting out of hand, she continued, keeping her voice low. We need to do something. The younger attendant hesitated. Like what? Meredith's eyes flicked toward Lena's seat, her expression momentarily unreadable. Then she straightened, smoothing down her uniform. I'll handle it, she said. She turned and started down the aisle. Lena heard the footsteps before she saw Meredith appear beside her seat, the forced politeness on her face barely concealing the tension underneath. Ms. Whitmore, Meredith said smoothly, folding her hands in front of her. Can we have a word? Lena didn't move. She didn't even blink. We already had one. Meredith's smile didn't falter, but there was a slight tightening around her mouth. I mean privately. Lena tilted her head. We're in first class. Nothing about this is private. A flicker of frustration passed through Meredith's eyes, but she controlled it quickly. I just wanted to clear up any misunderstanding. We want all our passengers to feel comfortable, and I'd hate for this situation to be misrepresented. Lena raised an eyebrow. Misrepresented? Yes, Meredith said, keeping her voice light. Sometimes things don't come across the way they're intended, and I'd love to find a way to resolve this before it gets out of proportion. Lena held her gaze, letting the words settle. You mean before too many people see it? Meredith's jaw tensed. Lena leaned forward slightly. I'm not taking it down. A flicker of something colder, sharper passed through Meredith's expression before she forced another smile. Well, she said, smoothing down her uniform, I suppose that's your choice. She turned on her heel and walked away. Lena could still hear the faint hum of her phone, vibrating with new notifications. The conversation wasn't over. Number it was just beginning. Lena could feel the shift in the cabin before she saw it. The atmosphere had changed, subtle but undeniable. Conversations hushed as passengers sneaked glances at their phones, then at her. The first-class cabin, usually a space of quiet detachment, was now alive with unspoken tension. She took another look at her screen. The video had surpassed 10,000 views in under an hour, and the number was climbing fast. Retweets from activists, educators, and even a few journalists filled her notifications. Some were calling for Skybridge Airlines to issue a statement, while others demanded a formal apology. But not all the attention was positive. Axa Skybridge loyalist. Maybe if people stopped looking for problems everywhere, they'd enjoy their flights more. Real American mom. Another entitled passenger crying racism to get attention. Do better. Corporate elite. So sick of these manufactured outrages. Just take your seat and shut up. Lena exhaled slowly. She had known this was coming. The pushback, the accusations, the gaslighting. She scrolled further and froze when she saw a tweet from Skybridge Airlines' official account. We are aware of the concerns raised regarding a passenger's experience on Flight 3128. Skybridge Airlines is committed to providing a welcoming and professional environment for all travelers. We are reviewing the matter internally and will follow up accordingly. A non-response. A corporate shrug. The kind of statement designed to say absolutely nothing while pretending to address everything. And she knew what that meant. Skybridge wasn't ignoring this. They were strategizing. Her stomach tightened. Across the aisle, Oliver Vance leaned toward her. That was fast. Lena turned her phone so he could see. They're trying to contain it. He nodded thoughtfully, which means they're taking it seriously. She wasn't sure if that was a good thing. At that moment, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing minor turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Lena barely noticed the slight shift in the plane's movement. Her attention was locked on the two figures walking down the aisle toward her. Meredith Cole wasn't alone this time. Beside her was a man in a navy blue uniform, Skybridge's onboard service manager. He was taller, broader, with the kind of posture that suggested authority. Lena set her phone down and straightened. Here we go. Ms. Whitmore, the man greeted, his tone firm but polite. I'm Jacob Mills, head of in-flight services. I understand there's been some concern regarding your experience. She folded her arms. That's one way to put it. He gave a tight smile. We take all passenger feedback seriously, and we want to ensure everyone feels comfortable on this flight. There it was again. That word. She kept her expression neutral. Define comfortable. Jacob glanced at Meredith before continuing. We'd like to resolve this matter as smoothly as possible. If there was a misunderstanding, we're happy to clear it up. But we also want to ensure that all passengers adhere to our policies, including our social media guidelines. Lena's fingers curled against her lap. Social media guidelines? Meredith's voice was softer now, feigning concern. We understand you may have felt slighted. That was never my intention. But recording and posting content about crew members during a flight can create unnecessary tension, and we want to avoid escalating the situation. Lena tilted her head. Let me get this straight. I record something that actually happened, and now I'm the problem? Jacob's expression didn't change. We simply ask that passengers refrain from using social media in a way that may cause disruptions. A thin, restrained anger settled in her chest. So, I should just delete the video? She asked, voice calm but pointed. We would appreciate that, Jacob said smoothly. Lena took a slow breath. They weren't apologizing. They weren't acknowledging what happened. They were trying to silence her, and she had a choice to make. She could comply, make this go away, pretend like none of it mattered, enjoy the rest of her flight in peace, or she could double down, refuse, stand her ground, knowing full well that this could escalate in ways she couldn't yet predict. She glanced at Oliver, who was watching intently but saying nothing. This was her fight, her decision. She met Jacob's eyes. No. The word hung between them, sharp and final. Meredith shifted. Jacob exhaled through his nose. Are you sure you want to do this? He asked, his voice lowering slightly. Lena didn't blink. Yes. Jacob studied her for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Meredith hesitated, her gaze flickering with something between irritation and disbelief, before following. As they disappeared toward the front of the plane, Oliver let out a low chuckle. Well, he said, I think you just made this a lot bigger. Lena exhaled, pressing her fingers against her temples. Yeah, she muttered. And then her phone buzzed again. She picked it up, and this time, the notification wasn't from Twitter. It was an email. Subject: Media Inquiry. Interview request regarding your flight experience. Her breath caught. This wasn't just a viral post anymore. This was national. She set the phone down, heart hammering. Whatever happened next, there was no going back now. Lena stared at her phone screen, the words Media Inquiry. Interview request regarding your flight experience glowing back at her. The sender's name was unfamiliar, but the organization wasn't. The National Observer, a major outlet. This wasn't just some internet chatter anymore. This was news. She felt her pulse in her fingertips as she scrolled down. Ms. Whitmore, we've been following the discussion surrounding your experience on Flight 3128. We'd love the opportunity to hear your perspective. If you're open to an interview, please let us know at your earliest convenience. She exhaled sharply. This was happening too fast. The buzz of conversation in the first-class cabin had changed. She could feel the weight of new awareness around her, like a slow, tightening coil. Passengers who had barely noticed her before now stole sideways glances, whispering in low tones. Lena could see the divide forming. Some looked at her with quiet support, subtle nods, small smiles, a shift in body language that said, "We see you." But others? Others wore tight expressions of disapproval, shifting uncomfortably, as if merely being near her had become inconvenient. And then there was Meredith. She had retreated to the front of the plane, standing near the galley, her back rigid as she spoke in hushed tones with another flight attendant. Every so often, she would glance over her shoulder toward Lena, her jaw clenched. Lena turned back to her phone. Do I respond? She knew what an interview would mean. More visibility, more exposure, more scrutiny. She was still debating when Oliver leaned in slightly, speaking low enough that only she could hear. They're talking about you up there. Lena didn't need to ask who they were. She pressed her lips together. Figured as much. Oliver's gaze flicked toward her phone. Let me guess. Press? She nodded. He sighed. You're in it now. As if on cue, a voice crackled through the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be starting our descent into San Francisco shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are up. Flight attendants will be coming through the cabin for final checks. Lena felt a flicker of relief. Almost there. Then movement caught her eye. Jacob Mills, the onboard service manager, was making his way down the aisle again. This time he wasn't alone. A uniformed air marshal followed him. The hair on the back of Lena's neck stood up. Her breath slowed as she watched them approach. Every part of her knew what was coming, but she refused to shrink back. When Jacob stopped beside her seat, he didn't bother with pleasantries. Ms. Whitmore, we need to speak with you when we land. Lena didn't blink. Why? The air marshal, a stocky man with a shaved head, crossed his arms. We've been informed of a situation on board. We need to ask you a few questions upon arrival. Oliver shifted beside her, his posture stiffening. This is ridiculous, he muttered. Jacob's tone remained carefully neutral. We just want to clear things up. If you cooperate, this will be handled quickly. Lena let out a slow breath. She wasn't stupid. This wasn't about clearing things up. This was about control. She glanced past them toward the front of the plane, toward Meredith, who was watching from the galley. The message was clear. Know your place, stay in line, or there will be consequences. Lena met Jacob's gaze and held it. Fine, she said evenly. Jacob gave a curt nod. Good. Enjoy the rest of your flight. As they walked away, Lena could feel the weight of stares pressing in on her from all sides. Oliver exhaled sharply. This is a setup. Lena let out a dry laugh. Oh, you think? He leaned in slightly, voice low. You need to be smart about this. Whatever they ask you when we land, they're hoping you'll react. Give them something they can twist. Lena pressed her fingers to her temple. I know. But knowing didn't make it easier. She turned back to her phone, fingers hovering over the email. Then, without overthinking it, she typed a response. I'd be happy to talk. Call me after we land. She hit send. Then with her pulse steady, she sat back and prepared for what came next. The wheels of the plane touched down with a gentle jolt, but inside Lena's chest, everything felt like it was shaking. She inhaled deeply as the aircraft taxied toward the gate, her fingers gripping the armrest just a little too tightly. Stay calm. Stay collected. She had handled worse. Parent meetings where she was spoken to like a child, school board reviews that tried to erase history, whispers in the teacher's lounge that had nothing to do with curriculum and everything to do with her existence in that space. But this was new. Oliver adjusted his glasses beside her. You ready? Lena exhaled, forcing her grip to relax. Not even a little. A soft chuckle rumbled in his throat. Good. That means you're thinking. The overhead chime dinged, and passengers immediately scrambled to unbuckle, reaching for bags and coats, eager to step back into their own lives. But Lena wasn't going anywhere fast. She felt it before she saw it. The presence, the waiting. Two uniformed men, one from airport security and the air marshal from before, stood just outside the cockpit door. Jacob Mills stood with them, his hands neatly clasped in front of him, as if this were nothing more than standard procedure. Passengers filed past her, curious eyes darting back toward her seat. Some sympathetic, some wary, others just entertained by the unfolding spectacle. Lena stayed seated. If they wanted to make a show of this, she wasn't going to help them. Jacob cleared his throat. Ms. Whitmore, please come with us. Oliver's voice was the first to cut through. She's entitled to know why. The air marshal didn't blink. There were concerns about a disturbance on this flight. We just have a few questions. Lena unclasped her seatbelt, adjusting her blazer as she stood. If they expected fear, they wouldn't get it from her. She grabbed her carry-on, squared her shoulders, and stepped into the aisle. The walk toward the exit felt longer than it should have. Meredith Cole stood near the galley, her arms crossed neatly over her uniform. The corners of her mouth curled slightly, not quite a smirk, but damn near close. Lena didn't stop. She didn't flinch, but she saw it, and that was all she needed. The minute she stepped off the plane, the controlled artificial chill of the jet bridge gave way to the stark reality of the terminal. Cameras, a lot of them. Her breath hitched. How did they know? Oliver emerged behind her, swearing under his breath. Jesus, they're already here. Microphones were raised, flashes flickered, and suddenly her face wasn't just a viral moment anymore. It was a headline. A reporter, a young woman with a press badge clipped to her blazer, stepped forward. Ms. Whitmore, do you believe Skybridge Airlines racially profiled you? Another voice. Did the crew try to remove you from the flight? Her grip tightened around her bag strap. The security officers didn't react. They had to have known the press would be here. She had two options. She could keep walking, ignore them, let this play out in the media without her voice, or she could take control. Lena turned, her chin lifting just slightly. I'm happy to answer questions, she said, her voice steady. But let's get one thing clear first. She took a step forward. The only disturbance on that flight was being treated differently than the people around me. A silence settled, just for a second. Then, an explosion of voices. She braced herself, because this was only the beginning. The flood of reporters surged forward the moment Lena spoke, their voices clashing over one another like waves in a storm. Questions came at her from all directions, but the words blurred together in the chaotic hum of camera shutters, microphone booms, and the collective buzz of something bigger than herself unfolding in real time. Oliver moved closer, his posture tense, like a silent shield between her and the crowd. The airport security team, initially standing back as neutral observers, finally started motioning for the press to keep their distance, though it was too late to contain the moment. Lena steadied herself. Stay in control. Stay focused. A reporter pushed forward, voice cutting through the noise. Ms. Whitmore, are you planning to take legal action against Skybridge Airlines? Another one followed before she could answer. Do you believe this was an isolated incident, or do you think the airline has a pattern of discrimination? Lena drew in a breath. The temptation to unload everything, to lay bare every frustration, every injustice, Every silent battle she had fought just to exist in spaces that weren't built for her was heavy on her tongue. But she knew how this worked. She had seen it happen before. One misstep, one phrase twisted out of context, and the narrative would shift. She wasn't about to let them control this. "I don't need to speculate," she said, keeping her voice even. "The video speaks for itself. I was treated differently than the passengers around me. I wasn't disruptive. I wasn't causing a scene. I was simply existing in my seat, and that was apparently enough to be questioned." A murmur rippled through the crowd. They weren't expecting her to be this direct. "Are you saying Skybridge Airlines has a racial bias?" someone shouted. Lena's jaw tightened. "I'm saying experiences like mine aren't new. They don't just happen in the air. They happen in boardrooms, classrooms, neighborhoods, and everyday interactions that too many people choose to ignore. But today, I refuse to be ignored." The clicking of cameras intensified. The moment had shifted and she could feel it. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was a movement waiting to ignite. But then, a voice broke through, sharp and calculated. "Ms. Whitmore," a male reporter near the back called out, "isn't it true that you've had professional conflicts before? We found reports from your school district about disagreements over curriculum. Would you say you have a history of stirring controversy?" Lena felt her stomach drop. There it was, the first punch in the smear campaign, the first attempt to paint her as a troublemaker rather than a victim. The journalist held up his phone, the screen showing an old news clipping. It was from years ago, when she had spoken out against the district watering down the history curriculum, a battle she had barely won. They weren't just digging up information. They were crafting a narrative. Lena's grip on her bag tightened, but before she could speak, Oliver stepped forward. "Are you suggesting that standing up for accurate education is equivalent to causing controversy?" His voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable edge of authority to it. "Because if that's your angle, you might want to reconsider how you frame this." The reporter hesitated, clearly not expecting the pushback. Oliver continued, "Or is the real issue that a black woman advocating for fairness makes people uncomfortable?" A hush fell over the group. Lines were being drawn. Lena met the journalist's gaze and held it. "I stand by every fight I've ever taken on," she said firmly, "and I won't apologize for demanding that people be treated with dignity. If that's controversial, then maybe we should ask why." The murmur grew again, but this time it wasn't just noise. This time it was momentum. Lena could feel the moment slipping into something bigger than her, bigger than just one flight, one video, one confrontation. Then out of the corner of her eye, she saw the Skybridge Airlines PR representative approaching. A man in a gray suit, flanked by a woman holding a clipboard. Their faces neutral, but their posture too controlled. Damage control. They were about to make their move. Lena took a slow breath. She had to be ready. Lena watched as the Skybridge Airlines PR team moved toward her, their expressions calculated, smooth, unreadable. The kind of practiced neutrality that only came from years of handling scandals without admitting fault. The man in the gray suit stepped forward first, extending a hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Whitmore, I'm Alan Curtis, Director of Corporate Communications for Skybridge Airlines. We'd love to have a private discussion with you about your concerns." Private? Of course, because they didn't want an audience for what came next. Lena crossed her arms. "You mean away from the cameras?" Alan chuckled softly as if they were old friends. "Just so we can speak openly. We want to resolve this matter in a way that works for everyone." A familiar script. Lena knew how this played out. Contain, control, minimize. She stole a quick glance at Oliver, who was watching the exchange carefully. His silence spoke volumes. He knew what they were doing too. Lena turned back to Alan. "If you want to have an open discussion, we can do it right here." Alan's smile tightened by a fraction. "Ms. Whitmore, we understand you've had a frustrating experience. Skybridge Airlines takes customer feedback very seriously, and we are happy to address any concerns you have in a way that—" Lena cut him off. "Is that why your airline's first response was to imply I was the problem?" A flicker of something cold and sharp passed through Alan's eyes before his PR training kicked in. "We never meant to make you feel that way," he said smoothly. Our goal is always to ensure all passengers have a comfortable experience. There it was again. Comfortable. Lena let out a breath, slow and deliberate. Comfortable for who? A pause. Alan wasn't expecting to be challenged so directly. The clipboard woman next to him, clearly his assistant, stepped in. Ms. Whitmore, if we could just take a moment to... Lena shook her head. No, Alan blinked. Excuse me? I said no. She let the words settle, let the weight of it linger, because this was what they expected, that she'd be eager to work with them, to accept whatever quiet, corporate-approved non-apology they were about to offer. But she wasn't going to play by their rules. The only thing I want to hear, she continued, is whether Skybridge Airlines is prepared to take accountability for what happened on that flight, not just to me, but to the other passengers who've shared similar experiences. Alan's jaw tightened just slightly, but his voice remained neutral. We're reviewing the situation internally. Lena scoffed. You're reviewing it? The world has already reviewed it. The video is out there. The conversation is already happening, with or without you. Alan inhaled through his nose, exhaling slowly. She had pushed him to the edge of his script, to the place where corporate language faltered against plain truth. Finally, he adjusted his tie, clearing his throat. Ms. Whitmore, we'd like to invite you to a private meeting with our senior leadership team to discuss this further. A new strategy, a delay tactic. Lena saw it for what it was. She glanced at Oliver again. This time he spoke. She doesn't need a meeting, he said, voice smooth but firm. She needs an answer. Alan turned to him, assessing, recalculating. And you are Dr. Oliver Vance. And I think we both know that if this isn't handled correctly, your company will be dealing with more than just public backlash. A shadow of irritation flickered over Alan's face. The conversation was slipping out of his control. The cameras were still rolling. The reporters were still listening. Lena took a small step forward, lowering her voice just enough to make the next words feel heavier, more deliberate. I'll meet with you, she said, but not behind closed doors. If Skybridge Airlines wants to have this conversation, we'll have it publicly. Alan stiffened, just for a second. That wasn't what he wanted. Lena saw the moment he realized he had no good response. If he refused, it would look like Skybridge had something to hide. But if he agreed, he'd be handing over control of the narrative to her. His mouth parted slightly, but no words came. Lena had him cornered. The tension stretched, held, until finally Alan forced another tight smile. We'll be in touch. Then without another word, he turned, signaling to his assistant as they walked away. Lena watched them go, her pulse steady. They weren't done, but neither was she. Beside her, Oliver exhaled. That was impressive. She gave a small, dry laugh. It's not over yet. He nodded. Number, but you just forced them to play by your rules? Lena let that sink in. For the first time since stepping off the plane, she didn't feel like the one being cornered. She was holding the mic now, and she wasn't letting go. Lena didn't even make it out of the terminal before her phone started buzzing nonstop. She had barely processed what had just happened with Skybridge's PR team when her screen lit up with a call. Unknown number. She hesitated. Could be a journalist, could be a lawyer, could be someone looking to intimidate her. She pressed decline. Oliver glanced at her as they navigated through the crowded terminal. That's going to keep happening. Lena exhaled, tightening her grip on her bag. I know. They reached the baggage claim area, where the familiar hum of airport chaos, rolling suitcases, beeping carts, chattering travelers, felt jarringly normal compared to the storm raging outside this building. Her notifications were relentless. Her video had now passed 250,000 views. The hashtags #Justice for Lena and #Boycott Skybridge were trending. More news outlets were picking up the story. More people were weighing in. The narrative was expanding beyond her. And then, buried among the flood of messages, she saw one that made her stomach tighten. From Principal Douglas. We need to talk. Call me ASAP. Her breath hitched. Of course, she should have known this would reach her job. Oliver must have caught the change in her expression. What is it? She turned her phone so he could see. He let out a low whistle. That didn't take long. Lena swallowed hard. No, it didn't. They stopped near a bench, just outside the airport's glass doors, the evening air crisp against her skin. Oliver sat down beside her, rubbing his hands together. You think they're panicking? Lena huffed. Oh, absolutely. The school doesn't like attention, especially this kind. She stared at the message again. She could already hear Douglas's voice, already imagine the discomfort in his tone, the way he'd try to make it sound like he was on her side while also urging her to back down. She sighed, pressing the call button. The phone barely rang twice before Douglas answered. Lena. His voice was tight, edged with forced calm. Lena cut straight to the point. I saw your message. What's going on? A pause, then, there are some concerns. Lena closed her eyes briefly. Concerns. Douglas cleared his throat. Look, I'm not saying I don't support you, but this situation is getting a lot of attention, and some of the parents, of course, the parents. Lena could already guess which ones. She gripped the phone tighter. Let me guess. Martha Reynolds? Douglas hesitated. That was all the confirmation she needed. She's leading a group that's pushing for a formal review, he admitted. They're questioning whether this kind of public controversy aligns with the values of the school. Lena let out a sharp laugh. You mean they don't like that I'm speaking up? Douglas sighed. Lena, you know how this works. The board doesn't want the school involved in something political. She felt the familiar burn of frustration rising in her chest. Political? This isn't political, Doug. This is my life, my experience. I didn't ask for this to go viral. I didn't ask to be treated like a suspect on a flight I paid for. And I sure as hell didn't ask for a bunch of parents to decide whether or not I have the right to talk about it. Another pause. Then Douglas softened his tone. Look, I get it, but I need you to think about your job here. Your students. Lena flinched. That was a low blow, and he knew it. She would never do anything to jeopardize her students. But that's not what this was about. This was about control. Douglas sighed again. The board is holding an emergency meeting. You should come in tomorrow. Lena's jaw clenched. Am I being suspended? No, Douglas said quickly. Then after a beat, not yet. Lena felt something cold settle in her chest. She nodded to herself. Fine, I'll be there. When she hung up, her hands were shaking. Oliver didn't say anything right away. He just watched her, waiting. She took a slow breath. They're coming after my job. Oliver leaned back, exhaling. Of course they are. Silence stretched between them. Then he asked, Are you ready for that fight? Lena thought about her students, about the history she refused to dilute, about the parents who wanted her silenced. Then she thought about Meredith, about Skybridge's PR team trying to control the narrative. She looked down at her phone again, at the messages flooding in, at the support and the backlash, at the headlines forming around her instead of with her. And then she lifted her chin. I guess we're about to find out. Lena sat in the parking lot of Booker T. Washington High School, staring at the glowing red numbers on the dashboard clock. 7:58 a.m., 2 minutes before she had to walk inside. She exhaled slowly, fingers drumming against the steering wheel. The campus looked the same as it always did. Rows of parked cars, students milling around, teachers juggling coffee cups and lesson plans. But everything felt different now. Her phone vibrated. Oliver. You good? She hesitated before replying. Lena. Define good. A second later, Oliver. Ready to burn the place down if needed? She let out a small, humorless chuckle. Lena, always. But the moment she slipped the phone into her bag, reality settled back in. The emergency meeting had been scheduled too fast. The pressure from Martha Reynolds' group must have been worse than she thought. They wanted her here early, before students arrived, before too many people could ask questions. Classic containment. She grabbed her things and stepped out of the car, rolling her shoulders as she made her way inside. The main office was quieter than usual, the receptionist barely glancing up as she entered. Douglas was waiting. He stood near the conference room door, his face carefully neutral. The look of a man trying to distance himself from the fallout. Lena, he greeted, glad you could make it. She gave a tight smile. Didn't feel like I had a choice. He didn't deny it, just motioned for her to follow him inside. The room was smaller than expected, more intimate than the massive school board chambers, another sign that they didn't want this public. 4 people sat at the long conference table. Superintendent Joyce Holloway, a woman in her 60s with a hardened expression, sat at the head of the table. To her right, George Trask, a board member Lena barely tolerated, mostly because he subscribed to the idea that history should be less divisive. Next to him was Angela Murray, a quiet but pragmatic member who rarely took sides too soon. And of course, Martha Reynolds, sitting like she owned the room, hands folded neatly, a smug sort of patience on her face. Lena felt the weight of what was coming before anyone spoke. Douglas cleared his throat. "Let's get started." Joyce folded her hands. "Miss Whitmore, I'm sure you're aware of why we've called this meeting." Lena met her gaze head on. "I have a few guesses." Joyce nodded. "Your actions in the last 24 hours have put the school in a difficult position." Lena arched a brow. "Which actions? Boarding a flight? Or speaking up about how I was treated?" Trask exhaled sharply. "Lena, this isn't personal." Lena let out a short, dry laugh. "Oh, but it is." Angela spoke for the first time. "What the board needs to determine is whether this situation has impacted your ability to remain effective in your position." Lena's stomach twisted. There it was. They weren't suspending her for misconduct. They weren't accusing her of violating school policy. They were questioning whether she was too controversial to keep teaching. Martha, silent until now, leaned forward slightly. "Some of us believe a teacher should remain neutral, not involve themselves in unnecessary conflicts." Lena bit back the urge to laugh. "Neutral?" she echoed. "You mean silent?" Martha gave a tight-lipped smile. "We mean professional." Lena tilted her head. "So standing up for myself, talking about something that happened to me personally, is unprofessional?" Martha spread her hands. "It creates division. Parents are concerned about what messages are being brought into the classroom." Ah, there it was. It was never just about the flight. This was about every lesson she had ever taught that made parents like Martha Reynolds uncomfortable. Joyce straightened. "We're here to discuss how we move forward, and we'd like to give you an opportunity to de-escalate the situation." Lena's jaw tightened. De-escalate how? Trask sighed as if this was exhausting for him. "The board would like you to consider issuing a statement clarifying that your personal experiences do not reflect the views of the school, that your comments were made as a private citizen and not as a representative of Booker T. Washington High School." Lena stared at him. They wanted her to distance herself from her own reality. Before she could respond, Angela added, "And until things settle, we're recommending that you take a leave of absence." Lena's pulse slowed. There it was, the ultimatum. Not a suspension, a recommendation. A way to push her out without making it look like they were forcing her. Martha leaned back, pleased. Douglas wouldn't meet her eyes. Lena gritted her teeth. A leave of absence wasn't just about time away from the classroom. It was a warning, a leash, a reminder of who held the power in these walls. She had 2 choices. She could comply, take the leave, issue the statement, and try to salvage what was left of her career. Or she could refuse, knowing damn well that meant they'd find another way to push her out. The whole room waited. Lena inhaled slowly, feeling the weight of every decision she had ever made that led her here. Then she lifted her chin. "No." Martha's smirk faded. Joyce blinked. "Excuse me." Lena sat up straighter. I'm not issuing a statement to make certain parents feel better. And I'm not taking a leave of absence because they're uncomfortable with me telling the truth." Trask bristled. "Ms. Whitmore," Lena leaned forward, "if you want me gone, you'll have to fire me." Silence. A tense, stretching silence that held more weight than anything they had expected to hear today. Martha's lips parted slightly, caught off guard for the first time. Angela looked away, pressing her fingers together. Douglas rubbed his temples. Joyce exhaled through her nose. "Lena." But Lena wasn't backing down. She held her ground, held her voice steady. "If you fire me," she said, "you'll have to explain why. And I promise you, if you try to take my job because I refuse to be silent, I won't go quietly." Another heavy silence. Lena could feel the shift, This wasn't the conversation they had planned. Joyce finally spoke, choosing her words carefully. The board will discuss the matter further. We'll be in touch. That was not a decision. That was a delay tactic. Lena didn't care. She stood, pushing back her chair, slinging her bag over her shoulder. Without another word, she walked out. Her heart was pounding. Her hands were steady. And she knew without a doubt, this was far from over. Lena stepped out of the school administration building, her breath sharp against the crisp morning air. The weight of the meeting still clung to her, but she wasn't surprised. She had walked in expecting an attack, and they had delivered, but what they hadn't expected was her refusal to back down. She made her way toward the parking lot, phone buzzing relentlessly in her bag. Emails, texts, mentions. The fire wasn't dying down, it was spreading. She slid into her car and let the silence settle around her for a moment before checking her phone. A text from Oliver. Oliver. Well, they try to put a leash on you. She smirked. Lena. More like a muzzle. Another buzz. This time an email with a subject line that made her stomach twist. From National Educators Association. Subject. We'd like to talk. Potential collaboration. Her eyes skimmed the preview. They wanted to discuss her situation, possibly bring her on for an education reform initiative. She exhaled. This was getting bigger. Fast. But before she could fully process that, another text came in. Unknown number. Ms. Whitmore, we need to talk. Call me at your earliest convenience. She frowned. Then almost immediately, another email. From Skybridge Airlines legal team subject. Formal notice of review. Passenger complaint. Her blood went cold. A complaint? She opened the email, scanning the body of text. Ms. Whitmore, this letter serves as a formal notification that Skybridge Airlines has initiated an internal review regarding your conduct aboard Flight 3128. The airline has received complaints citing disruptive behavior and failure to comply with crew instructions. As part of our review, we may need additional statements from you. Failure to respond could result in further action, including potential travel restrictions on Skybridge Airlines flights. Lena let out a slow, steady breath. This was retaliation. They weren't just pushing back, they were building a case against her. Her hands tightened around the phone. This is what they do. When they can't silence you outright, they paint you as the problem. The school was trying to push her out. The airline was trying to frame her as the aggressor. And if she let them, they would win. She tapped Oliver's contact and hit call. He picked up on the second ring. Tell me it's good news. It's not. A beat of silence. Then his voice sharpened. What happened? They're coming after me, she said, gripping the steering wheel. The school board is pushing me out without actually firing me, and Skybridge just sent me a letter saying they're reviewing a complaint against me. Oliver cursed under his breath. They're flipping it. Exactly. He exhaled. Okay, listen. You need a lawyer, a real one. Not just press attention, someone who can handle this legally. Lena pressed her fingers to her temple. Yeah, I know. Another pause, then, Lena. Something in his voice made her sit up. What? There's another way. She hesitated. What do you mean? He exhaled. We take it bigger. Her pulse skipped. Bigger how? You said the video was already bigger than you. Then let's use that. Lena stared at the windshield, heart pounding. She knew what he was suggesting. Go public, not just online, on national television. Force Skybridge and the school to answer for what they were doing. Her gut twisted. If she did this, there was no undoing it. No returning to the life she had before. This wasn't just about a flight anymore. It was about everything. Her phone buzzed again. Another email, this time from a producer at Good Morning America. We'd love to feature you. Are you open to an exclusive interview? Lena's breath caught. She could feel it, the moment where everything was about to change. She swallowed hard and whispered, let's do it. Lena sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open, the glow of the screen illuminating, the exhaustion settling in her bones. The email from Good Morning America was still pulled up, the invitation staring back at her like a door waiting to be opened. She had spent the last hour reading it over and over, running through every possible outcome in her mind. If she said yes, she'd be stepping into a storm she couldn't control. If she said no, she'd be letting Skybridge and the school board bury her in silence. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. A text popped up from Oliver. Oliver, don't overthink it. Just hit send. She smirked slightly, shaking her head. Lena, you realize this is about to get messy, right? Oliver, it was already messy. Now you're just making sure they don't get to control the narrative. She exhaled. He was right. She wasn't going to win this fight by waiting for things to settle. They weren't going to settle. She clicked reply. I'm in. Let me know the details. She hit send before she could second-guess herself. The moment the message disappeared from the screen, her nerves kicked in full force. She had just put herself in the national spotlight. Her phone rang almost immediately. Unknown number. She debated ignoring it, but finally answered. Hello. A deep, measured voice spoke on the other end. Ms. Whitmore, this is Daniel Carter from the American Civil Rights Legal Fund. I'm reaching out because we've been made aware of your situation. Lena straightened. How? We've been monitoring the discussion around your case, and we believe this could set an important precedent. Lena blinked. Precedent? Daniel's voice remained calm but firm. Skybridge Airlines is trying to intimidate you. Your school board is trying to silence you. We've seen this before, and it's time to push back. She stayed quiet, processing. You need a legal team, he continued. If you're interested, we'd like to offer our support. Her pulse quickened. She had been so focused on the public fight, the headlines, the viral debate, that she hadn't fully considered the legal one. You think I have a case? She asked. Daniel didn't hesitate. Absolutely. She exhaled slowly. This was getting bigger by the second. Let me think about it, she said finally. Of course, Daniel replied, but I'd advise you to decide soon, because I can guarantee you, Skybridge already has a legal team working against you. The line went dead. Lena set her phone down, staring at the screen, her mind racing. She had expected backlash. She had expected people to push back. But now it was turning into a full-scale battle. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, and that meant there was no turning back. Lena stepped into the Good Morning America studio, the bright lights casting a sharp contrast against the steady hum of controlled chaos in the background. The producer greeted her with a firm handshake. Ms. Whitmore, thank you for being here. Lena managed a small smile. Thanks for having me. It still felt surreal. Just days ago, she had been a history teacher walking onto a plane. Now she was national news. A makeup artist did quick touch-ups as the lead anchor, Cameron Hastings, approached her. Cameron was polished, professional, but there was something else in her eyes, a quiet understanding. She sat across from Lena as the countdown began. Ready? Lena exhaled slowly. Let's do this. The intro music faded and the cameras went live. Cameron turned to face the audience. This morning we're speaking with Lena Whitmore, a high school history teacher whose viral video has ignited a nationwide conversation about discrimination in the airline industry. Ms. Whitmore, thank you for joining us. Lena nodded. Thank you for having me. Cameron leaned in slightly. Let's start with the moment this all began. Walk us through what happened on that flight. Lena recounted the boarding pass check, the skipped drink service, the quiet but undeniable treatment that set her apart from the other first-class passengers. She kept her voice steady, her words clear. This wasn't about anger. This was about truth. Cameron listened intently, then asked, Some have questioned whether what happened to you was really about race. How do you respond to that? Lena had been waiting for this question. She met Cameron's gaze. The thing about bias, she said, is that it doesn't always look like a shouting match. It doesn't always come with slurs or raised voices. Sometimes it's a pause before handing you your drink, a second glance at your boarding pass when no one else gets one, a decision, silent but intentional, that says, you don't belong here. A murmur rippled through the live audience. Cameron nodded. Since your video went viral, Skybridge Airlines has released a statement saying they are reviewing the situation. Have they reached out to you directly? Lena gave a tight smile. But they did send me a letter saying I was under review. Cameron's eyebrows lifted. They're investigating you? Lena nodded. They're trying to flip the script, to make it seem like I was the problem. Cameron's expression sharpened. What do you say to that? Lena didn't hesitate. I say I won't be silent. Another murmur in the crowd. Then Cameron went for the biggest question. There's been speculation that you're considering legal action. Are you? Lena took a slow breath. She hadn't planned on making this decision here, but she felt the weight of the moment. She thought about the people who had messaged her with their own stories. She thought about her students, watching to see what standing up for yourself really looked like. She thought about every time she had let something go to keep the peace. Not this time. She looked directly at the camera. Yes, she said. I am. The audience gasped. Cameron blinked. So to be clear, you are officially pursuing legal action against Skybridge Airlines? Lena's jaw tightened. Yes, and against my school district if they try to fire me for speaking out. The studio exploded in noise. Cameron turned toward the camera. Well, you heard it here first. Lena Whitmore is taking this fight to the courts. Lena sat back, pulse steady. It was out there now. No more speculation, no more hesitation. She had just declared war. Lena barely made it out of the studio before her phone exploded. Calls, texts, emails. Her interview had aired less than an hour ago, but the response was already uncontrollable. She scrolled through Twitter. Her name was everywhere. Stand with Lena was trending. So was number Fire Lena Whitmore. Both sides were mobilizing. The messages of support flooded in first. Black women lead. Lena Whitmore is doing what so many of us have had to do. Stand alone and fight for our dignity. We stand with you, sister. Equal rights now. It's time to hold corporations accountable for the way they treat black passengers. Skybridge Airlines, we're watching. Then came the attacks. To Patriot Mom 78. She's making this about race for attention. Typical. Here's her truth is dead. Fire this woman immediately. She's an activist, not a teacher. And then, one that made her stomach turn. Justice for real Americans. Hope you like lawsuits, Lena. Or worse, she stared at the screen, fingers tightening around the phone. Threats. Of course. She had known this would happen, knew how these battles played out, but knowing didn't make it easier. A text came through. Oliver. Oliver. Lena, where are you? Are you seeing this? Lena. Yeah, I see it. Oliver. Get somewhere safe. People are pissed. She closed her eyes briefly. Then, her phone rang. She hesitated before answering. Hello? Ms. Whitmore, this is Detective Ryan Bishop with the San Francisco Police Department. Lena froze. We were contacted about a possible threat against you. Someone sent a message to your school's email claiming you're an enemy of America who needs to be stopped. Her breath hitched. Bishop's voice remained steady. We don't have a specific suspect yet, but we're taking it seriously. Do you have a safe place to stay? Lena swallowed. I think so. We advise you to be cautious, and if anything feels off, call us immediately. She nodded even though he couldn't see her. Okay. The call ended. She set the phone down, staring at the empty seat across from her. The fight had just escalated, and now it wasn't just her job, her reputation, or her lawsuit on the line. It was her safety. Lena sat in the dim glow of her apartment, phone clutched tightly in her hand. The detective's words echoed in her head. An enemy of America who needs to be stopped. Her pulse was steady, but her mind was racing. She had fought battles before, but never one that came with threats to her life. A soft knock on her door snapped her back to reality. She moved cautiously, peeking through the peephole. Oliver. She exhaled in relief and unlocked the door. The moment he stepped inside, he shut it behind him and locked it again. His expression was grim. You okay? He asked, scanning her face. Lena hesitated. I don't know. He let out a slow breath, then pulled out his phone. Skybridge's lawyers just released a statement. She braced herself. Let me guess. Damage control? Oliver handed her the screen. Skybridge Airlines takes all customer concerns seriously and is fully committed to reviewing Ms. Whitmore's experience. However, we are also reviewing multiple reports of disruptive behavior from other passengers on board Flight 3128. We encourage respectful dialogue as we continue our investigation. Lena let out a bitter laugh. There it is. They're painting me as the problem. Oliver nodded. They want the public to doubt you, to make this about both sides. She clenched her jaw. They were trying to gaslight the world, and it was working. Oliver sat down across from her. Lena, listen to me. You need full protection now. Legal, security, everything. Lena rubbed her temples. I don't even know where to start. Oliver reached into his pocket and slid a business card across the table. Daniel Carter, civil rights attorney. Lena stared at it. We talked, Oliver said. He's ready to represent you, and he's bringing in bigger support. Lena swallowed. Bigger? Oliver's gaze was serious. Lena, this case isn't just about you anymore. They're coming for you because they know what this means. If you win, it sets a precedent. If you lose, they keep doing this to people like you. Lena felt her breath slow. She thought about the students who had told her she was the first teacher who made them feel seen. She thought about the passengers on that plane who stayed silent. She thought about the message it would send if she backed down now. Her fingers brushed over the business card. Then she looked up at Oliver. Call him. Oliver nodded. We're going to war. Lena exhaled, steadying herself. No, she corrected. We're going to win. Epilogue. 1 year later. The courtroom was silent as the judge cleared his throat. The court finds that Skybridge Airlines engaged in discriminatory behavior and violated federal anti-discrimination laws. The words landed like a shockwave. Lena sat frozen for a moment before Oliver grabbed her hand, squeezing it. She won. She had taken on one of the biggest corporations in America, and won. Her phone vibrated. A flood of texts. Black women lead. Justice served. Thank you, Lena Whitmore, for refusing to be silent. Skybridge boycott. We said we wouldn't forget, and we didn't. Justice for Lena. Lena exhaled, closing her eyes briefly. She had lost her job. She had faced death threats, smear campaigns, corporate gaslighting, but she never backed down. And now, they had to listen. She stood, shaking hands with her legal team as cameras flashed. This wasn't just her victory. This was a message to every person who had ever been told to stay quiet. Lena stepped outside into the sunlight, feeling the warmth against her skin. A reporter called her name. Ms. Whitmore, what's next for you? She smiled. Whatever comes next, I'll be ready. And she meant it. Lena's story is about more than just one flight. It's about every moment we're told to stay quiet. Every time the world expects us to shrink ourselves to make others comfortable. But she chose to stand up, and in doing so, she forced the world to listen. So here's the question. When faced with injustice, would you have the courage to speak out, even if the consequences could change everything? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you don't want to miss more powerful stories like this, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because sometimes the fight for change starts with just one voice.